The stranger at Widow Hale's gate carried more than a wound. By sundown, Ruth Hale would wish she had never opened the door, and by midnight, she would know she could not have done anything else. The wind came low across the Red Mesa flats, dragging dust through the yard and rattling the loose boards of the chicken shed. It was late autumn in Arizona territory, the kind of evening that made a woman feel every empty room in her house. Ruth stood at the kitchen table with flour on her hands and a silence around her so deep it seemed to breathe. For 14 months, she had lived alone on the Hale place. Her husband, Matthew, had died in the wash behind the east pasture after a fever took hold of him faster than any prayer could catch. Folks in town said Ruth was strong. They said it kindly, with soft faces and lowered voices, as if strength was a blanket they could hand her and then walk away. But strength did not mend fences by itself. It did not haul water from a stubborn well. It did not sit across from her at supper when the lamp burned low and the coyotes began crying from the ridge. Ruth had learned to fix a broken hinge, patch a roof, and lead a mule through mud without losing her temper. She had learned to sleep with a rifle near the bed and a chair braced under the front door handle. She had even learned to stop setting out 2 plates. Most nights. That evening, she was cutting biscuit dough when her old mare lifted her head outside and gave a nervous snort. Ruth froze. The knife stayed pressed in the dough. Her eyes moved to the window. At first, she saw only the last amber light lying across the yard. Then a rider came out of the dust, slow and unsteady, his horse stumbling as it reached the gate. The animal was dark with sweat, its head low, one hoof dragging just enough to make Ruth's jaw tighten. The man in the saddle looked worse. He wore a black coat faded brown at the shoulders, a hat pulled low, and a gun belt that had not been put on for show. His right hand held the reins. His left was clamped hard against his ribs. Even from the window, Ruth saw the stain spreading under his fingers. Blood. She wiped her hands on her apron, took Matthew's rifle from the wall, and stepped onto the porch. The rider looked up. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The wind lifted the edge of Ruth's skirt and pushed a strand of hair across her cheek. The man swayed in the saddle, but he did not reach for his gun. Instead, with a care that seemed almost foolish for a man bleeding at her gate, he took off his hat. "Evening, ma'am," he said. His voice was rough but not wild. Tired, maybe. Pained, surely. Yet there was a quiet steadiness in it that made Ruth listen instead of shouting him away. "This is private land," she said. "I know it." He glanced at the rifle, then back at her face. "I'm not here to take anything. My horse needs water and I need a corner of your barn until first light. I can pay." "You always ride up to a widow's place bleeding and asking for shelter." His mouth tightened, not quite a smile. "No, ma'am, today has gone poorer than most." Ruth kept the rifle raised, though not aimed at his heart. "What happened to you?" "Trouble I should have left sooner." "That is not an answer." "No." His eyes lowered for a breath. "It is the only one I can give standing upright." The horse shifted, gave a weak shake of its head, and nearly folded at the knees. The rider leaned forward, catching the saddle horn. Ruth saw his face then, pale under the dust, with a scar near his temple and eyes the color of storm-dark wood. She should have sent him away. Every sensible part of her knew it. A lone woman did not invite a gunman onto her land. A widow with no hired help did not trust a stranger whose blood was still wet. People disappeared in that country for less foolishness than kindness. But then the man tried to climb down. His boot missed the stirrup. He hit the ground hard on one knee, one hand still gripping the reins, his hat falling into the dust beside him. He stayed there, breathing through his teeth, refusing to make a sound. Ruth's grip tightened on the rifle. "What's your name?" she asked. "Caleb Rusk." She did not know the name. That did not make it clean. "Well, Caleb Rusk, your horse can have water. You can have the barn. But first I am going to look at that wound." He lifted his head. "I did not ask for doctoring. And I did not ask for a dead man in my hay." His eyes met hers again. Something passed through them, quick and guarded, like a door opening just enough to show there was a room behind it. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Ruth helped him only as much as pride allowed. He leaned on the gatepost more than on her. Still, when his sleeve brushed her hand, she felt how cold he was. Too cold for a man who had ridden through warm dust. She led the horse to the trough, then brought Caleb through the back door. The kitchen seemed to shrink around him. He was tall, broad in the shoulders, carrying the smell of leather, sweat, and open trail. Ruth noticed the 2 revolvers at his hips and the way he unbuckled them without being asked, laying them on the far end of the table with the handles turned away from her. That one small act troubled her more than if he had argued. Bad men could be polite. Matthew had told her that once. The worst ones often were. "Sit," she said. He sat. She cut away the side of his shirt and found a long tear across his ribs. Not a clean bullet hole, thank the Lord, but close enough to make her hands go still. A graze, deep and angry, packed with dust at the edges. "Who fired on you?" she asked. Caleb stared at the lamp flame. "Men who wanted something back." "What?" His jaw worked once. "Me." Ruth looked at him then. He would not meet her eyes. Outside, the wind pressed against the house, and somewhere in the barn the stranger's horse gave a low, uneasy sound. She cleaned the wound with boiled water and spirits while Caleb gripped the chair so hard his knuckles whitened. He never cursed, never begged. Only once did he breathe her name, though she had not told it to him. "Mrs. Hale," he whispered. Ruth's hand stopped. "How do you know my name?" Caleb went still. The lamp hissed softly between them. Before he could answer, Ruth heard something fall from the pocket of his torn coat onto the floor. A folded paper slid beneath the table, yellowed at the edges, marked with a seal she had seen only once before at the marshal's office in Silver Creek. She picked it up before he could stop her. Across the front, written in a firm black hand, were 3 words. "Witness must survive." Ruth looked from the paper to the wounded stranger sitting in her kitchen. And for the first time since Matthew died, she felt certain of one thing. The danger had not arrived at her gate by accident. Ruth did not unfold the paper. She only held it between 2 fingers and watched Caleb Rusk's face as if the truth might rise there before it rose from the ink. For a moment, the kitchen seemed too small for both of them. The lamp threw a yellow ring across the table. His revolvers lay quiet near the flour tin. The smell of spirits and blood hung sharp in the room. "You knew my name," Ruth said. "Now there is a paper on my floor saying a witness must survive. I will hear the truth before I take one more stitch." Caleb's eyes moved to the window, not like a man looking for escape, but like a man listening for riders beyond the dark. "I was told this place belonged to Matthew Hale's widow," he said. Ruth's throat tightened at the sound of Matthew's name in a stranger's mouth. "Who told you?" "A deputy marshal in Silver Creek." "You came from Silver Creek." "Not by choice." Caleb drew in a careful breath and let it out slowly. "I was riding with him this morning. We were meant to reach Prescott by tomorrow with a signed statement. Men found us in the canyon near Dry Bell Ridge." Ruth looked down at the paper. "A statement against who?" Caleb's mouth set hard. Pain had put sweat along his brow, but there was another kind of strain in him now. The kind that came from old shame being dragged into fresh light. "Silas Vane." The name struck the room colder than the wind. Ruth knew that name. Every rancher in that part of the territory knew it, though most said it carefully and never after dark. Silas Vane owned freight wagons, cattle contracts, a saloon in Silver Creek, and half the men who wore badges there. He loaned money to struggling ranches, then took the land when the debt turned sour. He smiled at church picnics and sent hard men to collect what paper could not. Matthew had hated him. Ruth remembered that now with a sharpness that made her fingers close around the folded paper. Matthew had come home angry more than once, dust on his coat, saying Vane's men were cutting trails across private land and buying silence with threats. Ruth had told him not to borrow trouble that did not belong to them. Then fever came and trouble waited. "What did you witness?" she asked. Caleb looked down at the bandage, half tied around his middle. "Enough to hang him if the court is honest, enough to ruin him if it is not." "That is still not an answer." "No," he said. "It is me trying to decide how much danger I can lay at your feet before you tell me to crawl back into the dust." Ruth stepped closer. Her shadow fell across him. "You already brought the danger here." His eyes lifted. "I know." There was no excuse in his voice. That troubled her too. A man who defended every wrong was easy to judge. A man who knew the weight of what he carried made judgment harder. She set the paper on the table and went back to the wound. "This will hurt," she said. "It already does." "Then it will hurt worse." She poured spirits over the torn flesh. Caleb's hand shot to the table edge, but he made no cry. His shoulders shook once. Ruth worked fast, her own stomach tight, remembering the old army medical book Matthew had once bought for reasons neither of them had understood. She threaded the needle with fingers that only trembled when Caleb was looking away. "Were you one of Vane's men?" she asked. The needle pierced skin. Caleb shut his eyes. "Yes." Ruth stopped only for a heartbeat. Then she pulled the stitch through. Outside, the lantern hanging by the back door swung in the wind, sending shadows crawling across the wall like thin black fingers. "How long?" 6 years. "That is a long time to not know what kind of man you worked for." "I knew enough." His voice was lower now, not all but enough. Ruth tied another stitch. "Then why leave?" Caleb opened his eyes and stared at the far wall. His gaze fixed on a small shelf where Ruth kept Matthew's tin cup, the one with a dent along the rim. "Because a boy died." The words landed quietly. That made them worse. Ruth's hand paused near the bandage roll. Caleb swallowed, and for the first time since he had entered her house, he looked less like a gunman and more like somebody's lost son. Vane wanted a homesteader pushed off a claim north of Silver Creek. Said the papers were false. Said the man had cheated him. I believed what was easier to believe. We rode out at dawn. There was shouting. A barn caught fire. I do not know who started it. The boy ran in for a little dog. He stopped. Ruth did not ask him to finish. The wind moved under the door and brushed cold air around her ankles. "I left that day," Caleb said. "Took copies of ledgers from Vane's office. Names, payments, land thefts, bribes. I thought I could hand them over and be done. But wrong does not let a man walk off clean just because he finally gets tired of carrying it." Ruth wrapped the bandage around him. Her anger had not left her. It had changed shape. It stood beside caution now, both of them watching him. "And the deputy marshal?" "Dead," Caleb said. Ruth's hands went still. "In the canyon." Caleb nodded once. His jaw tightened until the muscle jumped near his cheek. "He gave me the packet and told me to ride west. Said if I could not reach Prescott, I should find the Hale place. He said Matthew Hale once gave testimony against a crooked land agent and did not scare easy." Ruth turned away. The mention of Matthew's courage did not warm her. It hurt. There were parts of her husband she had folded away after his death because they were too bright to look at. His stubbornness, his laugh, the way he would stand in a doorway with both thumbs hooked in his belt when he had already decided to do what was right, no matter what it cost. She picked up the folded paper again and opened it this time. Inside was not the full statement, only a note written in hurried script. "If Rusk reaches Hale's place, shelter him until federal help comes. Vane has men watching the roads. Trust no badge from Silver Creek. Ruth read it twice. Then she looked toward the front room, where Matthew's old shotgun hung above the mantel. How long before they track you here? Caleb did not answer fast enough. Ruth looked back. How long? His face had gone very still. If they found the deputy's horse, he said, they may already know. A hard knock struck the front door. Not loud. Not frantic. 3 slow knocks, measured and certain, like the hand on the other side already knew it would be answered. Ruth reached for the rifle. Caleb reached for nothing, and somehow that frightened her more. A man's voice came through the door, smooth as polished wood. Mrs. Hale, open up. We are looking for a wounded rider. The knock came again. Ruth stood in the kitchen with the rifle in both hands, and for one strange second she thought of biscuits. The dough still sat on the table, pale and soft under a dusting of flour, waiting for a supper that had been ordinary only moments before. Her life had changed so fast that even the little things seemed left behind, like cups on a shelf after a house fire. Caleb rose halfway from the chair, his bandaged side pulling tight beneath his open shirt. Back room, Ruth whispered. I can stand with you. You can barely stand at all. His eyes moved toward the front door. Mrs. Hale, those men will not care that this is your land. Then they are about to learn something. The voice outside called again. Mrs. Hale, we do not mean harm. We only need a word. Ruth stepped close to Caleb. There is a storm cellar under the pantry boards. Matthew built it after a dust flood took half the stores one spring. Go down and pull the rug over the seam. Caleb looked at her, really looked, as if he wanted to argue and thank her at the same time. Ruth. The sound of her name from him was softer than it had any right to be. She hated that it steadied her. Go, she said. He gathered the folded paper and moved with painful care. Each step cost him. Ruth saw it in the tight line of his mouth and the way his hand pressed the wall for balance. Still, he took no gun from the table. That choice burned itself into her mind. The pantry board lifted with a low groan. Caleb lowered himself into the dark space beneath, jaw clenched, breath caught between his teeth. Ruth slid the board back, pulled the braided rug across it, then kicked a sack of potatoes near the edge to hide the uneven boards. Only then did she pick up the revolvers and place them in the flour barrel. The knock came a third time, harder. Ruth crossed to the front room. Matthew's shotgun hung above the mantel. The sight of it made her chest ache, but not with weakness, with memory. She saw him standing in that same room, telling her once that a home was not walls and timber. It was the line a decent person refused to let wickedness cross. She opened the door with the rifle held low. 3 men stood on the porch. The one in front wore a deputy's badge, but Ruth did not trust the shine of it. A badge could be bought. So could a smile. He was narrow-faced, with pale eyes and clean gloves too fine for trail work. Behind him stood a younger man with a red scarf at his neck and another with a beard cut close along his jaw. Their horses waited by the gate, restless in the wind. Evening, Mrs. Hale, the narrow man said. Name is Deputy Carver, sorry to trouble you after dark. Then do not. His smile remained, but something hard moved behind it. We are searching for a dangerous rider. Tall man, dark coat, wounded along the left side. He may have passed this way. Dangerous to who? Carver tilted his head. Pardon. You heard me. The younger man with the red scarf glanced past Ruth into the house. She shifted, blocking his view. Carver gave a small laugh, the kind a man used when he wanted a woman to feel foolish for asking plain questions. Dangerous to lawful men, Mrs. Hale. Lawful men usually introduce themselves before they start looking through a widow's windows. The bearded man's mouth twitched. Carver's smile thinned. May we come in? No. That was not a request I enjoy repeating. Ruth raised the rifle just enough to change the air between them. And that was not an answer I planned to change. But so could resolve. Carver looked at the rifle, then at her face. Mrs. Hale, if that rider is here, he may tell you he is a witness. He may say Sela's vein is after him. Men like Caleb Rusk know how to sound noble when they are cornered. Ruth said nothing. Carver took one slow step closer. He has killed before. Ruth's grip tightened. He rode for Vane, Carver continued. Collected debts, burned men out, broke families. You would be wise not to mistake a guilty conscience for a clean soul. From beneath the floor far behind her, Ruth heard nothing. No movement, no breath. Yet she knew Caleb had heard every word. The cruel part was that she believed some of it. A man did not wear 2 guns for 6 years under Sela's vein without leaving pain behind him. Caleb had not claimed innocence. Maybe that was why Carver's warning slid under her skin. A lie often came dressed too pretty. Truth came limping. If he is so dangerous, Ruth said, why are only 3 of you here? Carver's eyes changed. The question had found a soft place. We do not need more than 3. No, Ruth said. You expected to find him half dead. The man with the red scarf shifted his hand near his holster. Ruth lifted the rifle higher. Do not, she said. Her voice was quiet, but it carried. A horse stamped near the gate. Somewhere in the pantry, the old boards gave the faintest settling creak. Carver heard it. His eyes flicked toward the kitchen. Ruth stepped back and shut the door halfway, forcing his gaze back to her. If you have a warrant, show it, she said. If you do not, leave my porch. Carver stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his coat. Ruth's finger tightened near the trigger. Slowly he drew out a folded paper and held it up. Not a warrant, a banknote. She saw the Hale name written across the front before he tucked it away again. Your husband owed money before he died, Carver said softly. Debts can wake up at inconvenient times. Ruth felt the blood leave her face. Matthew had never told her. Or maybe he had tried, and grief had swallowed the memory. Carver saw the wound land, and smiled like a man who had found a door left unlocked. Shelter the wrong man, he said, and Sela's vein may decide this land belongs in steadier hands. Ruth thought of the north fence, the garden, Matthew's grave under the mesquite, and the lonely months she had survived one hard morning at a time. Then she thought of Caleb under the floor, carrying papers that might bring down the very man now reaching for her home. If this moment makes you wonder who deserves mercy, stay with the story, because Ruth is about to learn that the past is never as buried as folks pretend. Ruth met Carver's eyes. Tell Sela's vein, she said, that Matthew Hale's widow is still standing on Matthew Hale's land. Carver's smile died. He stepped off the porch, but before he mounted, he looked back once. Then we will come in daylight, he said, and next time we will not knock. The 3 men rode into the dark. Ruth waited until the hoofbeats faded. Then she barred the door, crossed to the pantry, and pulled back the rug. Caleb looked up from the cellar shadows, pale and silent. Ruth held out her hand. You heard him, she said. Caleb nodded. Then when you climb out of there, she whispered, you are going to tell me what my husband never did. Caleb climbed from the storm cellar slowly, one hand pressed to his bandaged ribs, the other gripping the pantry shelf until the wood gave a low creak under his weight. Dust clung to his shirt. His face had gone pale, but his eyes were clear, and that made Ruth angrier somehow. She did not want him fainting. She wanted answers. The kitchen had changed while he was hidden beneath it. The same lamp burned on the table. The same biscuit dough sat ruined under its skin of flour. The same wind worried the walls, but now every familiar thing seemed to be listening. Ruth stood with the rifle still in her hands. "Speak plain," she said. Caleb looked toward the front room, where the door was barred with a chair and a length of iron. "Your husband crossed Sela's vein before I ever had the courage to." Ruth's mouth tightened. Matthew was a rancher. He was more than that when he needed to be. The words struck deeper than praise should have. Ruth turned away and set the rifle against the table, careful and slow, because her hands wanted to shake and she refused to let Caleb see it. "What did Matthew do?" Caleb sat down, not because he wanted to, but because his body had reached the end of pride for the night. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, and stared at the floorboards as if the truth were written there. 3 years ago, Vane started buying debt from small ranchers, he said. Some debts were real. Some were made crooked by men who knew how to turn ink into chains. Your husband found out Vane had a clerk changing loan papers after folks signed them. Ruth remembered Matthew at the desk late at night, candle burning low, his shoulders bent over papers he would cover whenever she came near. She had thought he was protecting her from worry. Maybe he had been. Maybe that was the trouble. "He told me it was cattle accounts," she whispered. Caleb looked at her with a tired sadness. He was gathering names, dates, copies of notes. He brought them to a territorial judge passing through Silver Creek. Ruth sat across from him. The chair felt colder than it should have. "And the debt carver showed me." Caleb did not answer quickly enough. Ruth's eyes sharpened. Was it real? "Yes," he said, "but not the way Carver wants you to believe." The lamp snapped softly, and both of them looked toward it. Caleb continued. "Matthew borrowed against the ranch to buy time for 2 families Vane was forcing off their claims. He paid their back notes before Vane could seize them. From what I heard, he meant to settle his own debt after the fall sale." Ruth closed her eyes. For 14 months she had walked past Matthew's grave carrying anger she never spoke aloud. Anger that he had left her. Anger that he had not fought harder to live. Anger that all his goodness had not been enough to keep breath in him. Now another anger rose, but it had nowhere simple to land. "You knew this?" she asked. "Not then. I heard pieces later. While writing for Vane." The words cut, and she meant them too. Caleb accepted the wound without flinching. "Yes." Ruth stood so quickly the chair scraped the floor. "You helped the man who threatened my husband." "I did." "You may have ridden with men who came against this very place." "I may have." She turned on him. "And you sat at my table." His eyes lifted then, not defensive, worse, honest. "I did not know whose house this was until the deputy spoke your name this morning. After that, I should have ridden past." "Then why didn't you?" "Because the deputy was dead by then. Because the papers would die with me. Because I saw your barn and thought maybe Matthew Hale's courage had left some shelter behind." Ruth's face changed at that. Grief passed over it like cloud shadow. She walked to the stove and gripped the edge until the heat bit her palms. She welcomed the sting. It gave her something smaller than heartbreak to feel. "Do not use his courage to soften what you were," she said. Caleb's voice dropped. "I would not dare." Silence settled. Outside, a shutter knocked once against the wall. Somewhere in the dark, a horse blew through its nose. Ruth could feel the night pressing around the house, full of men who might return with daylight and a paper claim and guns hidden behind law. She turned back. "Where are the ledgers?" Caleb reached toward his coat, then stopped when pain caught him. Ruth took the coat from the chair and tossed it to him. He pulled a packet from the lining, wrapped in oilcloth and tied with black thread. Ruth stared at it. Such a small thing to carry so much danger. Caleb laid it on the table. Names of bought deputies, false notes, payments to Carver, land transfers, enough to make Vane answer if it reaches a federal judge. If, yes. And what am I supposed to do with it? Hide it until morning, then I ride out before Carver returns. Ruth gave a hard, humorless breath. You will fall out of the saddle before the first rise. I have made worse rides. That is not wisdom, that is stubbornness wearing a hat. For the first time, something almost gentle moved across Caleb's face. It vanished quickly, but Ruth saw it, and it unsettled her more than his guns had. She looked at the oilcloth packet again. Matthew had died without telling her the full shape of the fight he had entered. Now the fight had come through her door wearing dust, blood, and remorse. Ruth picked up the packet. There is a loose stone beneath the hearth, she said. Matthew used to hide cash there when riders came through. Caleb watched her cross the room. You do not have to do this. Ruth knelt by the fireplace and worked the stone free. Her fingers found the hollow place beneath, dry and dark. She slid the packet inside, then replaced the stone and brushed ash over the seam. When she stood, there was soot on her hands. I know what I have to do, she said. What I do not know is whether I can trust you while doing it. Caleb nodded once, as if that answer was fair. You should not trust me easy. I do not. Good. That word made her look at him. He leaned back, pain carved deep around his mouth. Easy trust gets people killed. Hard trust, the kind a person earns one act at a time, might keep us alive till morning. Ruth wanted to hate the sense in that. Instead, she went to the flour barrel, pulled out his revolvers, and set them on the table between them. Caleb did not touch them. A small sound came from outside. Not the wind. Not the mare. A soft scrape near the back window. Ruth reached for the rifle. Caleb's hand finally moved to one revolver. The lamp flame trembled as a shadow crossed the kitchen glass. Then a boy's frightened voice whispered from the dark. Mrs. Hale, please, don't shoot. I brought a message from your husband. Ruth did not lower the rifle. The shadow outside the kitchen window was small, hunched against the wind, with both hands raised where she could see them. Caleb stood beside the table, one revolver in his hand but pointed at the floor. His face had gone hard in the lamplight, not cruel but ready. Ruth could feel the whole house holding its breath around them. Step where I can see you, she called. The back door creaked open, just wide enough for a boy to slip inside. He could not have been more than 15. His coat hung loose on his narrow shoulders, and his boots were too large, caked with road dust up to the ankles. A red scratch marked one cheek. His cap was clutched tight in both hands, and his eyes moved from Ruth's rifle to Caleb's revolver, then back to Ruth as if deciding which one frightened him less. Name, Ruth said. Eli Turner, ma'am. Ruth knew the name. Turner was one of the families Matthew had once visited after sundown, coming home with mud on his cuffs and worry in his eyes. Your mother is Abigail Turner. Yes, ma'am. What are you doing at my window after dark? Eli swallowed. Mama said I was to come if men rode this way looking for Mr. Rusk. Caleb's eyes narrowed. You know me. The boy looked at him, and something like shame crossed his young face. I know of you. That answer seemed to land between them harder than a stone. Ruth lowered the rifle by an inch, not enough to be careless. You said you brought a message from my husband. Eli reached inside his coat. Caleb's revolver lifted halfway. Slow, he said. The boy froze. Ruth glanced at Caleb. He is a child. I have seen children used by men with no honor. Eli's mouth trembled, but he did as told. Slowly, he drew out a cloth packet tied with blue thread and held it toward Ruth. My mother kept it, he said. Mr. Hale gave it to her before he took sick. He told her if trouble ever came to your door, and if he was not there to stand with you, she was to send this. Ruth stared at the packet. The blue thread was familiar. Matthew had used thread like that to mend his shirts because Ruth always said blue was easier to see in poor light. A foolish little memory, small as a pin, slipped straight through her guard. Her fingers weakened around the rifle. She took the packet and set the rifle against the wall. Inside was a folded letter, worn soft from being handled, with her name written across the front in Matthew's hand. Ruth. Not Mrs. Hale, not my dear wife. Just Ruth, strong and plain, the way he used to say it when he wanted her to stop pretending she was not tired. She sat before her knees could fail her. Caleb turned away, giving her the small privacy of not watching grief strike. That act, quiet and unasked, made her chest hurt worse. Ruth opened the letter. The ink had faded, but the words were clear. Ruth, if this reaches you, it means my trouble has outlived me. I am sorry for that. I thought I could keep the worst of it from our door. Maybe that was pride. Maybe it was love wearing the wrong coat. Her breath caught. She read on. Sila's vein has taken more than land. He has taken men's names, their sleep, and their children's futures. I borrowed money to save the Turners and the Bell farm because I could not watch good people be swallowed by crooked paper. I should have told you. I did not because I feared you would ask to stand beside me, and I feared losing you more than I feared Vane. Ruth pressed one hand to her mouth. That was Matthew, brave enough to face a land thief, foolish enough to think love meant carrying every burden alone. The letter blurred, then cleared. There may come a man one day who looks guilty because he has been. Do not trust him for his sorrow. Trust him only if his actions prove he is done running from the truth. The law in Silver Creek is bent. The federal judge in Prescott may still be straight. If my papers and another witness ever meet, Vane can be brought down. Ruth stopped reading. Her eyes lifted to Caleb. He stood near the stove, hatless, pale, one hand braced against the wall. No defense sat on his face. No plea. He looked like a man being weighed by a dead man's words and knowing the scale might not favor him. Eli spoke softly. There is more, ma'am. Ruth looked back down. The last lines were shorter, pressed harder into the page. I hid my copies where the dry creek splits below the old windmill, under the flat white stone. If danger comes, do not let my silence be the last thing I gave you. I loved you poorly in this matter, but I loved you with all I had. Ruth folded over the letter and held it against her chest. For 14 months, she had thought Matthew's secrets were a wall between them. Now she saw they had been a door he had not known how to open. Love had been there, but fear had handled the key. If you have ever wondered whether silence can wound as deeply as anger, remember Ruth in this kitchen, holding a letter that came too late and still changed everything. Caleb's voice was low. Mrs. Hale, I am sorry. Ruth wiped her cheek with the heel of her hand. Do not be sorry yet. We still have to live long enough for it to matter. Eli stepped closer to the stove, shivering now that his errand had ended. Mama said Carver went to fetch more men. She heard it from Mr. Dobbins at the livery. They mean to come after sunrise, but there are 2 riders watching the south road already. Caleb looked toward the dark window. Then we cannot ride to Prescott by the road. No, Ruth said. She stood, still holding Matthew's letter. We are not riding to Prescott tonight. We are going to the old windmill. Caleb shook his head. That ground is open. If they have watchers, they will see lantern light. Then we do not take a lantern. The moon is thin. I know the land. You know it in daylight. Ruth put Matthew's letter into her apron pocket and picked up the rifle again. I buried my husband on this land in the dark, she said. Do not tell me what I know. Caleb fell silent. A faint sound came from outside, so soft Eli might have missed it if his fear had not sharpened him. A horse snorted near the wash. Then another. Ruth moved to the window and looked past her own reflection into the black yard. At the far edge of the moonlight, two mounted shapes waited beside the dry cottonwoods, still as fence posts, watching the house. Ruth did not move away from the window. The two riders sat beyond the wash, their outlines dark against the thin moonlight. They were not close enough to hear voices, but close enough to see the house, the barn, and any fool who tried to cross the yard with a lantern. Their horses stood quiet, trained for waiting. That told Ruth enough. "They are not passing through," she said. Caleb came to her side, keeping just behind the curtain. "No, they are measuring the place." Eli hugged his coat tighter around himself. "Mama said Vane's men do that before they take a ranch. They watch how folks move, who sleeps where, which door opens first in the morning." Ruth looked at the boy. He said it with the flat knowledge of someone too young to know such things, and yet he knew them anyway. Caleb's face darkened. "You should not have come alone." Eli's chin lifted a little. Somebody had to. For the first time that night, Ruth saw more than fear in the boy. She saw Matthew's doing, not in blood, but in courage passed from one household to another. Her husband had helped save the Turners, and now their son had crossed dark country to bring back a piece of him. The thought nearly broke her. She would not let it. "There is an outside hatch to the storm cellar," Ruth said. "It opens behind the smokehouse." Caleb turned to her. "You did not mention that before." "You did not need to know before." A faint, tired smile crossed his mouth. "Fair." Ruth went to the stove and pinched out the lamp flame until the kitchen dropped into gray shadow. Then she carried the lamp, unlit, into the front room and set it near the window. She took a fresh candle, lit it, and placed it behind the curtain so the light threw a shape against the cloth. From the yard, it would look like someone still stood inside. "Eli," she whispered, "can you handle a horse quiet?" "Yes, ma'am." "My mare is gentle, but she complains if a stranger touches her left side. Speak to her first. Do not rush her." Eli nodded. Caleb reached for his coat, then swayed before he could put it on. Ruth saw the color leave his face. "You are not fit for this," she said. "I know." That was not disagreement. "No," he said, "but I am going anyway." Ruth wanted to argue, but the truth stood between them. The papers under the windmill might mean nothing without the witness who could explain them. Caleb was not only a wounded man in her kitchen, he was part of the evidence, for better or worse. They moved through the pantry without another word. Ruth lifted the cellar board and the three of them climbed down into the cold dark. The air smelled of earth, old apples, and dust. Caleb had to turn sideways on the narrow steps, one hand pressed hard to his ribs. Eli went first with careful feet, feeling ahead in the black. The outside hatch opened with a groan Ruth wished she could swallow. All three froze. No shout came, no horse stirred. They slipped out behind the smokehouse into a strip of shadow. Ruth could see the riders from there, both still watching the front of the house where the candle made its false shape in the curtain. A mean satisfaction warmed her for one small second. Matthew had built that cellar for storms. Tonight it served a different kind. They crossed low through the yard, keeping the smokehouse and woodpile between them and the watchers. Eli reached the barn first. Ruth heard him whisper to the mare, soft and steady, like he was calming his own fear by giving comfort to the animal. Caleb took his horse, though the gelding turned its head and bumped his shoulder as if scolding him for standing upright at all. "No saddle," Ruth whispered, "too much noise." Caleb nodded. They led the horses behind the barn and into the dry wash, where the sand swallowed their steps. The wind had shifted colder. It moved along the wash in little sighs, carrying the smell of sage and old rain from places the clouds had forgotten. The old windmill stood half a mile east, where the creek split around a shelf of pale stone. Ruth had not gone there since Matthew died. The wheel had broken 2 summers ago, and its blades now turned only when the wind was strong enough to bully them. As they walked, Caleb's breathing grew rough. Ruth heard it, though he tried to hide it. "Stop pretending you are made of iron," she whispered. "I was hoping for tin at least." She almost smiled, then hated herself for it. They reached the windmill under a sky thin with stars. The broken blades creaked once above them, a lonely sound that made Eli flinch. Ruth knelt by the dry creek split and brushed aside sand with both hands. There were many pale stones, too many. Moonlight made them all look the same. "Matthew said flat white stone," Eli whispered. "They are all flat and white," Ruth said. Caleb lowered himself carefully and studied the ground. A man hiding papers would choose a marker he could find again without looking strange. Ruth looked at him. He pointed toward the windmill base. That one, near the third post, close enough to count steps from the ladder. Ruth crawled to it and dug her fingers beneath the edge. The stone lifted with a soft scrape. Under it sat a rusted tobacco tin wrapped in oilcloth. For a moment, nobody spoke. Ruth held the tin like it was a living thing. Inside were folded papers, a small ledger, and a ribbon-tied stack of notes in Matthew's hand. She wanted to read every word. She wanted to throw them into the dark for being 14 months too late. Caleb reached toward the ledger, then stopped. "May I?" Ruth handed it to him. He opened the first page. His eyes moved across the writing. Then he went still. "What?" Ruth asked. Caleb did not answer. She leaned closer and saw a list of payments copied in Matthew's careful hand. Dates, names, amounts. Beside one entry, the ink had been underlined twice. "See Rusk, field pressure, Hale boundary, $8. Ruth felt the night tilt. Her voice came out colder than the wind. "You came here before." Caleb stared at the page as if it had struck him. "I do not remember this place." "But you were paid for it." He closed his eyes once. When he opened them, they carried a grief so old it looked almost calm. Field pressure meant riding with Carver while he delivered warnings. I did too many to count. Sometimes I never knew the names. Sometimes I stayed at the road and let other men speak. Ruth stepped back from him. "My husband was threatened by men you rode with." "Yes. And now I am supposed to help save you with the papers he hid." Caleb's voice broke just slightly. "No, you are supposed to save the truth. I do not know if I deserve any part of that." Before Ruth could answer, a horse snorted behind the ridge. Eli grabbed her sleeve. "Mrs. Hale." A lantern flared at the top of the wash. Then Deputy Carver's smooth voice drifted down through the dark. "Widow Hale, step away from the papers." Ruth turned toward the ridge with Matthew's papers clutched against her chest. Deputy Carver stood above the wash with a lantern in one hand and a rifle in the other. The yellow light made his face look carved from old bone. Two men stood behind him, their hats low, their guns drawn but not yet raised. Behind them, farther back near the broken trail, Ruth saw the shape of another rider holding the horses. They had been followed. Or worse, they had been allowed to leave the house, so Carver could catch them with the proof in their hands. Caleb stepped in front of Ruth before she could stop him. "Carver," he said. Carver smiled down into the wash. "You look poorly, Rusk." "I have felt better." "I doubt you will again." Eli pressed himself behind the windmill post, small and shaking, but he did not run. Ruth saw the boy's eyes fixed on the lantern, wide with the kind of fear that never fully leaves a child once it enters. Carver took one slow step down the slope. "Mrs. Hale, you are in possession of stolen papers. Hand them up and I will forget tonight's foolishness." Ruth's fingers tightened around the tin. "These belong to my husband." "Your husband was a meddling rancher who should have kept his nose in his own trough." Caleb's revolver came up fast. Carver's men raised theirs. Ruth grabbed Caleb's sleeve. "No." His arm trembled under her hand, not from fear, but from the fight inside him. One pull of the trigger, and everything Matthew had saved might vanish into smoke and panic. Carver seemed to know it. "That is right," he said. "Listen to the widow. She has more sense than you ever did." Caleb lowered the gun by a few inches, his jaw hard. Carver looked at Ruth again. "You think those papers will save your land? They will bury you. Courts lose things. Judges get sick. Witnesses change their minds. But a widow caught helping a wanted gunman flee with stolen property, that story writes itself." Ruth felt the weight of every word. Carver did not need truth. He only needed control of the telling. For a moment she saw the whole trap. Caleb guilty enough to be doubted. Matthew dead enough to be slandered. Ruth alone enough to be pressed until she bent. The anger that rose in her was quiet and clean. "You are afraid of what is in this tin," she said. Carver's smile twitched. "That is the first honest thing I have seen from you." One of Carver's men shifted. Caleb noticed, so did Ruth. The wind caught the broken windmill blades. They turned once with a long, rusty groan. The sound made the horses above toss their heads, and the rider holding them cursed under his breath. Ruth looked at Caleb. Not long, not openly. Just enough. He understood. "Eli," Ruth whispered without moving her lips much, "when I tell you, drop flat." The boy's eyes flicked to her. Carver took another step down the slope. "Last chance, Mrs. Hale." Ruth lifted the tin in both hands. Carver stopped watching it. "You want Matthew's papers?" she asked. "Yes." "Then fetch them." She threw the tin high, not toward Carver, but toward the broken windmill. It struck one of the lower wooden braces with a loud crack and burst open. Papers flew loose into the night, caught by the wind like pale birds. Carver shouted. His men looked up. The lantern swung wide. "Down," Ruth cried. Eli dropped. Caleb fired one shot, not at the men but at the lantern. Glass shattered. Flame hit sand and went out under its own oil. Darkness slammed over the wash. The horses above broke into frightened movement. Men shouted. Ruth grabbed Eli by the collar and pulled him toward the creek bed. Caleb stumbled beside them, breathing hard. Papers skated across the sand, some caught in brush, some spinning away into blackness. Ruth hated leaving even one behind. But she had kept the ledger. When she threw the tin, she had held Matthew's small ledger flat beneath her shawl, pressed against her ribs. Caleb saw it now as they ran bent low through the wash, and even in the dark she felt his surprise. "You planned that," he whispered. "No," she said, "I survived it." A shot cracked above them, striking stone somewhere to their left. Eli gasped, but Ruth shoved him onward. The wash curved sharply near a cluster of mesquite. Caleb caught the branches and held them aside for her and the boy, then nearly fell as he followed. Ruth turned back and seized his arm. For a strange, breathless moment, he leaned on her fully. Not as a gunman, not as a witness, just a wounded man who had reached the end of what pride could carry. "Keep moving," she said. "I am trying." "Try harder." He gave a rough breath that might have been a laugh if pain had not stolen most of it. Behind them, Carver's voice cut through the dark. "Find them. She has the ledger." Ruth's heart kicked. "He saw," Caleb said. "Then we make sure he cannot catch us." They followed the wash north instead of west toward the house. Ruth knew that dry bed. It bent behind the ridge, then split near a stand of cottonwoods. One path led toward open grazing land. The other led toward the old Turner claim. Eli seemed to realize it at the same moment. "My mother," he whispered. Ruth's answer came hard. "We will not lead them to her." Caleb stopped, one hand against a rock wall, his breathing ragged, then split. "No. Listen to me. Carver wants me and the ledger. Give me a horse, I draw them east. You take Eli and ride north." Ruth stared at him in the darkness. "You would not make it 2 miles." I might make one, that may be enough. There it was again, the man Matthew had warned her not to trust for sorrow alone. But this was not sorrow speaking. This was a choice. A bad one, maybe. A brave one, surely. Before Ruth could answer, Eli pointed behind them. A lantern had been relit in the wash, far but moving. Carver was coming. Ruth pulled Matthew's ledger from beneath her shawl and pushed it into Caleb's hands. His face changed. "Ruth. You said hard trust is earned one act at a time," she whispered. "Here is yours." Then she turned to Eli. "Run north to the Turner place. Wake your mother. Tell her to send anyone loyal to Matthew Hale to the old church road by dawn." Eli shook his head. "I cannot leave you." Ruth gripped his shoulders. "You already came through the dark once. Now do it for all of us." The boy swallowed his fear, nodded, and vanished into the brush. Ruth turned back to Caleb. He held the ledger like it weighed more than iron. Hoofbeats entered the wash behind them. Ruth lifted her rifle. Caleb looked at her in the dark and whispered, "You should have let me run alone." Ruth set her shoulder beside his. "I was alone long enough." The hoofbeats came slow at first, then faster as Carver's men entered the narrow bend of the wash. Ruth stood beside Caleb with the rifle tucked hard against her shoulder. Her heart beat so loudly she wondered if the men could hear it over their horses. The moon had slipped behind a torn strip of cloud, leaving the wash in a thin gray darkness. Mesquite branches scratched softly in the wind. Sand moved around Ruth's boots like water. Caleb held Matthew's ledger inside his coat. His revolver was in his right hand, pointed down. Ruth could see the strain in his body, the way he favored his wounded side, the way each breath seemed to cut. Still, he stayed upright, not because he was strong enough, because he had decided falling was not allowed yet. "Rusk," Carver called from the bend. "You are bleeding, cornered, and standing with a widow who has already lost one husband to foolish pride. Do not make her lose more." Ruth felt Caleb stiffen beside her. "That man uses dead folks like tools," she whispered. "He has had practice," Caleb said. Carver's lantern appeared around the bend first, swinging from the hand of the bearded rider. Its weak light crawled over the wash wall, then over Ruth's skirt, Caleb's coat, and the barrel of her rifle. The riders stopped. Carver sat in the middle, his hat brim low, his badge catching a small flash of light. His smile had returned, but now it looked thin and hungry. "There you are," he said. "I was beginning to worry the desert had swallowed you." "Turn around," Ruth said. Carver gave a soft laugh. "Mrs. Hale, you are far from your porch. And you are still trespassing. That word sounds brave until a judge decides otherwise." Caleb lifted his revolver slightly. "You are not taking the ledger." "No," Carver's eyes moved to Caleb's coat. "Then I suppose we stand here until you fall over." One of the men behind him chuckled. Ruth saw Caleb's hand tighten. She also saw the danger. One shot from either side would turn the wash into chaos. Caleb might hit one man, maybe two. Ruth might fire once before the riders answered. But they were outnumbered, outlighted, and Caleb was barely standing. She needed another way. So she lowered the rifle. Caleb looked at her sharply. Carver's smile widened. "There is the sense I was waiting for." Ruth took one step forward. "Matthew Hale made copies," she said. Carver's expression did not change, but his horse shifted under him, feeling the change in its rider. Ruth went on. "He was careful, more careful than you knew. You may take one ledger tonight, but if I do not return by morning, more papers will travel. Names, payments, false claims, your name beside Sela's vein, S." Carver studied her. "You are bluffing." "Maybe." The wind moved between them. Ruth forced herself not to look toward the ridge where Eli had disappeared. She did not know if the boy had reached the Turner place. She did not know if anyone would come, but Carver did not know either, and uncertainty was the only weapon she had left that did not need reloading. Caleb understood. She felt it in the way his body went still. Carver leaned forward in the saddle. Your husband was not as clever as you think. No, Ruth said. He was more clever than I allowed myself to remember. For the first time, pain crossed her face openly. Not weakness, truth. Her voice softened, but it carried in the hollow wash. I spent 14 months angry at him for leaving me with silence. Tonight I learned he had been trying, in his clumsy way, to leave me a road. You cannot frighten me with his memory, deputy. I have already survived the worst of missing him. Caleb turned his face toward her. Something passed between them in that cold wash, something quiet and dangerous in a different way than guns. Trust, perhaps, not sweet, not easy, but real enough to stand on. If this moment touched your heart, stay with Ruth a little longer, because some roads through grief do not lead backward. They lead straight into the truth. Carver's smile was gone now. Take them, he said. The two men behind him dismounted. Ruth raised the rifle again. Caleb lifted his revolver. Nobody fired. Then from the darkness above the wash, a woman's voice rang out. Deputy Carver, I would tell those men to stand still. Every head turned. Abigail Turner stood at the ridge line with a shotgun in her hands. Beside her were 3 ranchers Ruth recognized even in the weak light. Tom Bell, whose farm Matthew had saved. Old Samuel Price, who had once traded seed corn for a broken plow. Mr. Dobbins from the livery, holding a rifle with both hands and looking scared but steady. Eli stood behind his mother, pale and breathless. More shapes appeared along the ridge. Neighbors. Not many, not an army, just people who had owed Matthew Hale the kind of debt no crooked paper could measure. Carver's men froze. Abigail's voice stayed firm. There are 6 more behind the rocks, and every one of them knows what you came for. Ruth did not know if that was true. It did not matter, it sounded true enough. Carver looked from face to face along the ridge. His badge no longer shone like law. It looked like a small piece of metal pinned to a lie. You people are interfering with official business, he said. Tom Bell spat into the sand. Funny, looks more like theft. Carver's hand moved near his holster. Samuel Price's rifle clicked from above. Carver stopped. For a long moment, the wash held still. Then Caleb stepped forward, swaying once before Ruth caught his arm. I rode for Sela's vein, he called up, his voice rough but clear. I helped frighten good people because I was too cowardly to ask whose orders I was obeying. I can name the men. I can name the payments. And if I live to reach Prescott, I will say it under oath. The words changed the night. Ruth felt it. So did everyone there. Confession had its own kind of power. It did not wash Caleb clean, but it put him in the open where lies had less room to grow. Carver stared at him with open hatred. You will never reach Prescott. A new voice answered from behind the riders. He will if I take him. A tall man stepped from the lower bend of the wash, holding a marshal's rifle and wearing a long dust coat. His beard was gray, his eyes sharp, and his badge was not polished bright but worn dull from use. Carver turned in the saddle. The man lifted his rifle. Deputy Carver, he said, by authority of the federal court in Prescott, you and your men will lay down your weapons. Ruth looked at Caleb. Caleb looked just as stunned. The gray-bearded marshal's gaze moved to Ruth. Mrs. Hale, I was told by a brave boy in half a frightened town that you might have something belonging to your husband. Ruth's knees nearly weakened with relief. Then Carver smiled again. Not at Ruth. Not at Caleb. At someone behind the marshal. A shot cracked from the dark ridge, striking stone near the marshal's feet. Horses reared. Men shouted. The lantern fell and the wash filled with dust and panic. Through it all, Ruth saw one rider break from the shadows and race south with a black satchel tied to his saddle. Caleb grabbed her arm. "Vane," he said. Silas Vane himself had been watching from the dark. The name left Caleb's mouth like a curse he did not want to own. Vane. Ruth saw only a dark rider cutting south through the scattered dust, the black satchel bouncing against his saddle. The horse was fast, lean, and already 20 yards beyond the wash before anyone understood what had happened. The gray-bearded marshal steadied his own frightened horse and shouted, "Hold your fire." That order saved lives. In the dark, with neighbors on the ridge and Carver's men in the wash, another shot would have turned fear into tragedy. Ruth kept her rifle tight against her shoulder but did not pull the trigger. Her eyes stayed on the fleeing rider. The marshal turned to one of his deputies, a young man Ruth had not noticed until then. "See to Carver, disarm every man with him." Carver had drawn his pistol halfway. Tom Bell from the ridge had him covered. Abigail Turner had her shotgun aimed low but steady. For all his smooth words, Carver looked smaller now, trapped between real law and the neighbors he had thought too frightened to stand together. Caleb took one step toward the fleeing rider and almost fell. Ruth caught him hard. "No. He has the satchel. You have Matthew's ledger. The satchel may have Vane's own books. And you have blood through your bandage." Caleb looked down. In the confusion, his wound had opened again. A dark patch spread beneath his coat. His face had turned the color of ash. The marshal came toward them, rifle still in hand, eyes sharp beneath his hat brim. "Rusk, can you ride?" Caleb straightened, lying with his body before his mouth had the chance. "Yes." Ruth answered first, "No." The marshal glanced at her, then at Caleb and seemed to believe Ruth more. Caleb's jaw tightened. "Marshal, Vane cannot reach Silver Creek. He owns too many doors there." "He will not go to Silver Creek," Ruth said. Both men looked at her. The answer had come to her before she could think it through. She knew the land. She knew what lay south. The dry stage road, the burned Mission Trail, the old ferry crossing that no one used unless they were desperate or hiding. "He will cut toward Mercy Ford," she said. "There is a crossing below the Salt Flats. Matthew used it in flood season. If Vane reaches it before dawn, he can vanish into the freight trails." The marshal studied her. "Can you show us?" Caleb turned sharply. "No." Ruth met his eyes. "Do not start giving orders now. You are not chasing Silas Vane through open country at night." "I am not chasing him. I am guiding the marshal." "That is the same road, wearing a cleaner shirt." Ruth stepped close enough that only he heard her next words. "Matthew left me a road, remember. I am going to walk it." Pain moved across Caleb's face, and beneath it fear. Not for himself. That realization struck Ruth harder than she expected. This man who had carried danger to her door now looked frightened by the thought of her riding into it. The marshal gave a low whistle to his deputy. "Keep Carver and the others tied and watched. At sunrise, bring them to the Hale place. We will gather the papers there." Carver laughed bitterly from where Tom Bell had forced his pistol into the sand. "You are all fools," he said. "Vane has judges, banks, freight men, land clerks. You think one night changes that?" Abigail Turner stepped down the slope, her face pale but fierce. "No," she said, "but one night can start it." No one answered her, because the truth of it was too strong for talk. Ruth's mare was brought from the lower wash, nervous but sound. The marshal mounted a bay horse, and Tom Bell insisted on riding with them. Caleb tried again to climb into his saddle. He made it one step, then stopped with one hand on the horn, breath locked behind his teeth. Ruth went to him. "Stay," she said softly. His eyes burned with shame. "I stayed too long in the wrong places," he said. "Now you ask me to stay when it matters." I ask you to live long enough to speak the truth." That silenced him. She took Matthew's ledger from him and pushed it into the marshal's hands. "If I fall behind, this does not." The marshal nodded once. "You have my word." Caleb caught Ruth's wrist before she turned away. His grip was weak but warm. "Ruth." She looked back. There were many things in his face, and none of them were easy. Regret, fear, gratitude, something gentler that neither of them had earned the right to name. "If I do not get to say this later," he said, "your husband was right. You would have stood beside him." Ruth swallowed the ache in her throat. "Then do not make me carry another dead man's unfinished sentence." She pulled her hand free and mounted. They rode south without lanterns. The night opened wide around them. The land rolled in long black shapes beneath a sky full of cold stars. Ruth led by memory, following the low cuts where water ran during storms, then turning west where the mesquite thinned and the ground grew pale with salt. Behind her, the marshal and Tom Bell rode close, trusting a widow who had spent 14 months learning every lonely mile of her own land. They found Vane's trail near the burned Mission Road. "Fresh prints, hard riding." "He is pushing the horse," Tom whispered. "He is scared," Ruth said. The marshal looked at her. "Good." But fear made men foolish, and foolish men could still be dangerous. Near dawn, they reached the ridge above Mercy Ford. The eastern sky had begun to pale, turning the land from black to gray. Below them, the old crossing cut through a shallow bend of water, silver in the early light. Silas Vane was there. His horse stood trembling near the bank. The black satchel lay open beside him. Papers were scattered on a flat rock, and Vane was feeding them one by one into a small fire. Ruth's breath stopped. The marshal lifted his rifle. Silas Vane stepped away from the fire. Vane turned. Even from the ridge, Ruth saw that he was not frightened anymore. His coat was dusty, his hat gone, his face calm in a way that chilled her. He lifted one burning paper and smiled. "Come down, Mrs. Hale," he called. "Your husband's name is on the next page." Ruth rode down the ridge before fear could talk sense into her. The marshal called her name, but she did not stop. Her mare picked her way over loose stone, ears forward, feeling Ruth's tight hands on the reins. Below, Silas Vane stood beside the little fire, holding the burning page between two fingers as if it were nothing more than an old receipt. But Ruth had seen Matthew's handwriting even from that distance. Her husband's name curled at the top of the page. "Drop it," she said. Vane smiled. "Widow Hale, you have your husband's courage. That is unfortunate. It did him no good either." The marshal and Tom Bell reached the bottom behind her, rifles ready. Vane did not reach for a gun. That made him seem calm, but Ruth saw the truth in the ash clinging to his sleeve. His hands were shaking. A man did not burn papers unless paper had become stronger than him. The marshal's voice was steady. "Step away from the fire." Vane looked at him. "Marshal, you are holding a wounded gunman's word, a dead rancher's scribbles, and the anger of frightened farmers. That is not law. That is noise." Ruth dismounted. Her boots touched the cold sand. "No," she said. "Noise is what men like you make so decent folks cannot hear the truth." Vane's eyes sharpened. Ruth stepped closer, slow and careful. "My husband's name is on that page. Read it." "Why would I?" "Because if you burn it without reading, everyone here will know you are afraid of a dead man." That struck him. Pride was a poor shield, but men like Vane often mistook it for armor. He glanced at the page, half burned at one corner, then laughed under his breath. "Very well. Matthew Hale received payment from Silas Vane, witnessed by Deputy Carver." Tom Bell made a sound of disbelief. Vane lifted the page toward Ruth. "There, your noble husband took my money like the rest." For a moment, Ruth felt the ground sway beneath her. Not because she believed Vane, but because cruelty spoken in a dead man's name still had teeth. Then she saw the rest of the page. The line under Matthew's name was not a receipt. It was a copy of a trap. Ruth reached into her coat and pulled out the letter Eli had brought, Matthew's last words folded close to her heart. "My husband wrote down everything," she said, "even the lies he expected you to tell." Vane's smile faltered. The marshal stepped forward and snatched the half-burned page from his hand, stamping the flame out against a stone. His eyes moved quickly over the writing. "This says Hale accepted marked money from Vane as proof of attempted bribery," the marshal said, "signed before 2 witnesses." Ruth looked at Vane. For the first time, his face emptied. Tom Bell pointed toward the black satchel. "There are more papers in there." Vane moved then, fast and desperate, kicking sand over the fire and lunging for the satchel. The marshal caught him before he reached it. They struggled only a moment. Vane was not used to fighting men who could not be bought. Tom Bell helped force his hands behind him, and the marshal bound them with a strip of rawhide. No shot was fired. No blood answered blood. The morning simply took him. When the satchel was opened, it held what Caleb had hoped and feared: account books, land notes, payment records, names of clerks, deputies, and judges who had eaten from Vane's hand. The marshal read in silence, and with every page, the shadow over the valley grew thinner. By full sunrise, they rode back to the Hale place. Caleb was on the porch when they arrived, wrapped in a blanket, pale as bone but alive. Abigail Turner stood beside him with a basin and a scowl that said she had been keeping him in his chair by force of will alone. Eli sat on the steps, trying to look grown and failing because relief kept shining through his tired face. When Caleb saw Ruth, he stood too quickly. Abigail snapped, "Sit down before I put you down." He sat. Ruth almost laughed, but the sound caught in her throat and became something softer. The marshal placed Vane's satchel on the porch table beside Matthew's ledger. "Mrs. Hale, your husband's work held. So did yours." Ruth looked toward the mesquite tree behind the house, where Matthew rested under a plain wooden marker. For the first time in many months, she did not feel abandoned when she looked that way. She felt answered. Caleb watched her from the chair. "I need to go to Prescott," he said, "when I can ride." Ruth nodded. "You need to testify." "I need to answer for more than Vane." That honesty settled between them. It did not promise an easy future. It did not turn the past gentle, but Ruth no longer wanted gentle lies. "Then answer," she said, "and when you are done, decide what kind of man walks back from it." His eyes lifted to hers. "If I came back this way someday, would your gate be closed?" Ruth looked at the gate, hanging open in the clean morning light. Dust moved softly around its posts. Beyond it, neighbors stood in small groups, tired and quiet, bound together by what they had dared before dawn. "I do not know," she said. "That depends on what you bring with you." Caleb accepted that, and she respected him more for not asking for softer words. Months passed before he returned. By then, Silas Vane had lost his land claims, Carver had lost his badge, and the Turner and Bell families held papers no crooked clerk could touch. Caleb had testified in Prescott and accepted his own sentence too: restitution, years of labor under federal supervision, and a record that would follow him. It was not ruin. It was not freedom either. It was consequence, and he carried it without complaint. He came back in spring, not as a gunman at sundown, but as a hired irrigation hand sent to help rebuild washed-out ditches across the valley. At Ruth's gate, he removed his hat. She stood on the porch with Matthew's letter in her apron pocket and sunlight on her face. "You look thinner," she said. "You look less angry." "I would not count on that lasting." This time Caleb smiled. Behind Ruth, the house was no longer silent in the same way. It still held grief, but grief had found room to breathe. The north field was green. The old windmill had new blades. Near the mesquite tree, Ruth had planted wildflowers around Matthew's grave, yellow and white against the red earth. If this story stayed with you, leave a quiet thought for the people who carry truth even when it costs them. And stay close for more frontier stories where justice does not always shout, but it still finds its way home. Ruth opened the gate. Not all the way. Just enough for a man to step through and begin earning the rest. And under the wide Arizona sky, with the wind turning the new windmill and the morning bright on the land Matthew had saved, Ruth Hale finally understood that some doors do not close because the past is forgotten. They open because the truth has come home.